And we are back. Did you guys have some lunch? Woo! Woo! I had some lunch from the delicious restaurant here in the house here in Slakthuset. We got, they got some good stuff. This is a great venue and with a lot of great and helpful people as well. So the first part of the day has been another audio program has passed, and now we're going to move in a more diverse track of speakers and sessions. We're going to start looking at World of Warcraft, but then we're going to dive into how you can grow your game studio within a crisis. We'll look into how you can apply agile development today, and we'll round it off later this afternoon with a panel on how gamers are now self-publishing their own game content before we move to a happy hour. But that is all for later. For now, I know a bunch of you have been very excited to hear our next speaker talk. He will talk about World of Warcraft in the last 2 decades, how the game and the design team has been able to grow alongside its fan base and be able to reinvent it and stay relevant up until today. Welcome on stage, Ian Hazzikostas.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here in Malmö. This is my first time in the city. I've been enjoying it very much and look forward to the rest of the week ahead. Let's get into it. So, as Marianne mentioned, I'm here to talk about what we've learned and how some of our design philosophies have changed over the last years, and how we're excited about how that sets us up to continue our live service for many, many years to come. Hopefully, this isn't just a talk for WoW fans, but is something that people who are thinking about any type of game development on an ongoing live service can take something away from. So just to start with some of the boring stuff before we get into the more interesting material, just want to talk a little bit about my own background. So I have been at Blizzard for 17 years. I've been working on World of Warcraft for 17 years, and that's been my journey in the industry. So you could say I'm a little bit of a specialist. I became game director in 2016, and I was on the World of Warcraft team, though, since 2008. I started off doing systems design and encounter design, worn a lot of hats over the years, but I would say I'm probably a systems designer kind of at my core. Prior to coming to Blizzard and how I got into the games industry, also a bit of an unusual background. I actually went to law school. I graduated from law school in 2004, thankfully just a few months before World of Warcraft came out. Otherwise, that might have been a bit of a different story. And then spent a few years practicing law by day and then rushing home to lead raids with my guild every evening. I ran a large community site and a pretty successful guild at the time, and through doing that was able to connect with people who worked at Blizzard. I would give them feedback, and I had a couple of people in my guild who got jobs at the company, and eventually I had this incredible opportunity come up, and I made a very large career transition in my late 20s. And I've never looked back, and it's really been just the honor of a lifetime to go from playing this game to helping craft its future. So I want to talk a little bit as well about where World of Warcraft is today. I assume everyone has just some basic level of familiarity with what the MMO is, but it's changed a lot in the last few years, and it's a very different game in some ways than it was 20 years ago when it all began. Back in 2004, there was World of Warcraft. Today, we have the continuation, the ongoing evolution of that game in the form of our War Within expansion that released last summer. That is our 10th expansion pack to World of Warcraft. But we also have a classic version of the game that we re-released in 2019 that is a recreation of that original 2004 experience, and we've continued to evolve that, offering classic versions of subsequent expansions as well. We've also had some experimental content in the classic space, adding new content, building upon that original foundation. All of these experiences have their own sub-communities, but they're all part of the larger World of Warcraft community and the World of Warcraft game that I'm going to talk about today. So again, just a quick rundown of sort of the business structure of WoW. WoW remains a subscription game. It's €13 a month, and that sub now includes access not just to the original ongoing version of WoW, but all of the classic versions that I just mentioned. We patch the modern version roughly every couple of months with major updates every 6 months. And we sell an expansion pack every 2 years or so, which offers a big power reset, a whole new setting, major changes to the game. Alongside this, we have an online shop with microtransactions and mostly cosmetics and some paid convenient services like renaming your character or changing realms. But really, the core of our business is and always has been this subscription model. And I have to say, as a designer, as a game developer, it's a huge honor and really it's a privilege to be able to work in that model, because I feel like it aligns our motivations, our business motivations, with players' motivations. And it lets us really just focus on keeping our community happy, because we all succeed by making a game that is as fun as possible for as many people as possible for as long as possible. And that's the end of it. There have been some changes to the structure of kind of how World of Warcraft systems and gameplay have worked over the years, to say the least. Originally, World of Warcraft always had this reputation as a game that requires a huge amount of time to really dedicate yourself to. There's still tons to do, but leveling is a much faster process. It's literally 10 times as fast just to jump in as a new player and get to the end game compared to where we were 20 years ago. But there is so much more to do in that end game. We have solo activities, single player questing, long-form narrative stories, repeatable content there. We have a wide variety of solo, small group, and large group experiences. Delve's a new feature we just added, as well as dungeons and raids. And you can do this pretty casually or at a very hardcore competitive level, depending on your skill. We have PvP, small group and large group as well. We have systems that encourage playing multiple characters and really support it in a way that the game didn't used to. And for many players today, this is actually a primary play style of theirs. They have dozens of characters that they just level and enjoy and almost build out their collection. And speaking of collections, we have 20 years worth of stuff to collect, thousands of achievements, cosmetics, and more. And we have role-playing communities that have been around, again, for 20 years and are part of World of Warcraft. Now, I list all of this out because all of these diverse experiences make up the experience of playing World of Warcraft today. I sometimes joke that you could have a dozen serious WoW players sitting around a table. You could ask them what it is that they do in WoW and why they play it, and you'd hear a dozen different answers. And I think that's exciting and awesome when we think about maintaining a diverse living world. It also makes our lives very challenging at times, because there are so many different interests and play styles and desires that drive the feedback that we hear in the community that we need to serve. Okay, now getting into the meat of things a little bit. 5 years ago, I was actually scheduled to give a talk at GDC 2020 reflecting on the first 15 years of World of Warcraft and design lessons learned along the way. Obviously, for obvious reasons, that 2020 talk didn't materialize, but in the course of preparing for this, I was looking back at my old notes, and one of the things that struck me almost immediately was that I actually no longer agree with a lot of the things that I was planning to say back in 2020. It's not that there were specific designs I was talking about that I now think were bad, but rather that the lens through which I was viewing a lot of these questions and a lot of these problems was a very different one back then. I think I'd been game director for a few years, and I was still viewing this in the context of design problems and through a very traditional design direction lens. I think when you think about game direction, design direction, creative direction, a lot of that traditionally involves having a vision that you put out there and kind of shepherding a large project, a team, many changes through that vision and ensuring that the game stays on track and largely aligned with what is meant to be at its core. And when I became game director, that was certainly the charge that was given to me by my predecessors. I had spent years learning why we made the decisions we made, what our philosophies had been since 2004, and my solemn responsibility taking over the reins of this game was to continue that lineage forward. Something that honestly freaked me out a little bit as someone who'd been playing the game since day one, was this responsibility and the fear that if I made the wrong decision, I might somehow steer this game off this track that it had been on and might somehow damage this pillar of the online gaming industry. But that's one approach. I think when you look at, and when I look at the community that we have and how that's evolved over the years, what I began to ask myself is whether that static vision is really the best way of serving an evolving community. And maybe what you need to do instead is to be able to evolve that vision, to be flexible with that vision to suit the times. And that rather than focusing on what are the right design principles or what are the wrong design principles and trying to solve an objective problem, it's more about asking how you meet players where they are and how you serve your community in the best way that you can and how you change and grow along with them. And so this talk is ultimately the story of how I got from point A to point B and that shift in perspective and what that's meant for the team as a whole that's come along on that journey and for our community today. So just to reflect on some of the history of the game over the last decade. In the 2010s, World of Warcraft had been around for quite some time, was really reaching some of the mature stages of an online game. Had to figure out how to expand a lot of their systems, how to add new content, how to keep the game growing. And a lot of those original designs weren't necessarily holding up in that context. And this is something that the design team spent a lot of time reflecting on back then. For example, they looked at just what seemed like just a lot of bloat in our systems and our classes. With every new expansion, with every passing year, we added new abilities because that's what you get when you level up. We added new things to earn, new rewards, new systems, and this just built on top of itself, one layer after another after another. And where that left us was a place that felt very complex, very unapproachable. And so I think the team started to take a step back and consider how they might do something about this. And one of the big solutions we landed on around the 2014-2016 era, Warlords of Draenor and Legion were the main expansions where this happened, was an initiative that we called ability pruning, the same way you might prune a plant or a tree that's kind of growing out of control to keep it more focused and growing in a healthy way. We went through and we removed a number of our systems. We removed some abilities that players had and gained over the years that were kind of not really about what their core had originally meant to be, and were making the classes feel more and more like each other over time, as well as making them harder to learn. We were seeing that our community, our players, were less social than they originally had been. Part of the magic of World of Warcraft in 2004 was that it was this engine for meeting new people and making connections. People made lifelong friends in World of Warcraft. Some people met their partners and more. And over time, as we had added new types of content to the game, we'd made rewards much more accessible to solo players and small group players. We found that they were drifting away from that content, and the game was starting to feel much more solitary for many of them. And so something that we set out to do, reflecting on how we'd changed the game, was to re-add some exclusivity in certain types of rewards, like the best cosmetic rewards and armor sets, to ensure that if you wanted to get those, you needed to be joining an organized raid group, let's say, and being social, because we felt that that was always a core part of the game. We needed to keep pushing players towards it. Yet another example. Over time, a lot of the friction that had existed in the early versions of World of Warcraft that made players make choices about their character, what they wanted to specialize in, had been eroded, had been removed. And we found that when players could change their skills very easily, could switch from one loadout to another on the fly, that ultimately they had moved from a world where they had strengths and weaknesses to one where they increasingly only had strengths and could spec out of their weaknesses, so to speak. And so we looked for ways to add some new systems into the game, like artifact weapons in Legion, where you had to pick one of several to really invest your time and energy into building up. And if you wanted to have all of them leveled, they were going to be weaker than if you had specialized in just one, as an example. The idea being, this was always meant to be a role-playing game. And people, in a role-playing game, you're making choices about what you want your character to be good at, what you want your character to be less good at. And that was something that we felt was important. So we were pushing in all of these directions, solving what seemed like design problems that had emerged as the game was evolving. And yet, our players were not thrilled about this, would you believe? And we were reflecting on this and wondering what more we needed to do to recapture something that it felt was slipping away when we compared how players had played the game in the past and what had been the core identity of the game that we as designers had all been trained by our predecessors to maintain, how do we get that back? Well, we couldn't, ultimately. In 2020, though, a pair of things happened that have changed a lot of the team's perspective on how we were looking at these problems and where we were. In the modern game, we released our Shadowlands expansion. And in the run-up to that, we had made some serious commitments to players that we really wanted to move back towards meaningful choice and, characters being different from one another based on your personal investment. And the community was telling us pretty loudly, we don't want this. We hear why you're saying it, but we just don't want it. At the same time, we had this miraculous opportunity, the wonderful chance to re-release the original classic version of the game, recreated with all of its original systems. And this became this incredible, science experiment, almost a giant A/B test of sorts, where we had been theorizing that player behavior was different because we had drifted away from our vision. Well, here we had a chance to literally re-release the 2004 version of the game. And what we found was that, yes, players still love that version of the game. It's a great game, and it holds up, and it built a strong community. We also found that players playing that version in 2020 played it very differently than they had 15 years prior. Whereas in the past, systems like increasing costs to change your talents around had deterred players from doing that and made them say, you know what, I like PvP and I like raiding with my friends. I'm going to make a build that's pretty good at both, instead of perfect at one and terrible at the other. In 2020, players weren't okay with being suboptimal. And so they actually just spent extra hours earning the gold, grinding that out so that they could change their specialization whenever they needed to always be optimal. And they complained bitterly about it. They're like, this is the least fun part of Classic, but we have to do it to play the game the way we want to today. In short, it wasn't that we had drifted away from our original vision or somehow failed it. It's that players had changed. And the vision was no longer serving our players in 2020, and so it needed to be updated. So the digression to kind of broaden this a little bit. If for anyone here who is working on or thinking about releasing a game that will have an ongoing live service component, if you put that out there and people come to it and are playing it, congratulations, that is an amazing accomplishment. But it's also essential to realize that the moment you release that out into the world, the nature of designing that experience is transformed. Before it was released, it was your vision. It was your thing, your team's thing to craft. Once it's out there and it has become home to some number of players, it is now equally theirs. And it is their world that you need to be a caretaker of, as well as the designer of. Players will have come to the game that you made, not the one you wished you'd made. And if something's out there for a little bit, the people who are drawn to it are going to be the ones who like what that gameplay is. And the people who don't like it are going to be filtered out or repelled. Now, whether this is an entire game, it could also apply to a subsystem in a game, like a class or whatever. Pretend you designed a mode or a class that you intended to be very tactical, methodical, slow-paced, and deliberate in its gameplay. But players came to it and figured out quickly that there was a way to play that thing that was much faster paced, and that you had greater success doing that, and that continued for a few months. The players who are doing that are presumably doing it because they like that gameplay. And if you try to change it to what you wanted it to be originally, you are doing a huge disservice to them. You're basically making a change that serves your own vision at the direct expense of what everyone has chosen and has gravitated towards. So it's essential when thinking about design changes to a live game that you do it first and foremost through the eyes of your community, and that you think about what they want and what they don't want. Here's just a brief tangent. So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of desire paths. This is one of my favorite little urban planning things. As you see here, desire paths are a natural phenomenon that you see all around the world. Not just humans, animals create them too. They just reflect the natural, efficient path that people yearn to take to get from one place to another. And if those paths are different than the ones that were laid out and planned, well, you will see what you see here. a dirt path cut through the grass that reflects hundreds and hundreds of people taking this path. I was thinking about trying to come up with a clever visual way of presenting my idea. When I started Googling around, I was delighted to discover that an artist had beaten me to it, so I'm just going to borrow what they did. Here, imagine you see a nice path laid out, a city park or whatnot. Very simple, perpendicular lines, a nice path through nature. Easy. But of course, this is what will happen, as we just saw. People want to get to the corner. Maybe they're catching a bus. Maybe they just want to cross the street quickly. They don't want to take the long path. They're going to take this path. Now let's imagine our urban planner friend had a vision. He had something in mind when creating this, and it did not include this path. So what does he do? Put a bench down. Don't walk this way. And also, if you want to sit and enjoy the nature around you, now you have a bench. You can, rest your legs. This is better, right? No. People are still going to try to take the path. All right, no, really. Also, stop littering in the park. Throw your stuff out in here. And walk on this nice straight path that we made for you. What's the problem? Of course, this is, people are people. This is going to continue as it will. OK, for real now. Just let's put this whole hedge here. And honestly, you can imagine this designer reflecting on this and saying, actually, it's a good thing that those paths happened, because where we landed is a better overall vision. It's a bit, this aesthetically nicer. It was a bit overly simple before. This is perfect. And maybe it holds up for a little bit, but no. And so here we find ourselves again. So what do you do in this situation as a designer? Well, you embrace what people are telling you and showing you very clearly they want to do. You make that a path that you support. And once you do that, things will be fine. For a while, anyway. So full credit to the artist here, Chaz Hutton. But the moral of the story here is, as a designer, as a developer, avoid falling into adversarial patterns, where you are fighting your players, where you're acting at cross purposes. And also think about the emotion that that's causing in them and what you're aiming to achieve. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who's commuting every day and trying to catch a bus and comes through this park and finds that there are obstacles in their path. How do they feel about the city planners who are doing that? Probably not great. Do you want your players to feel that way about you? OK, so you've probably seen memes of the perfect whatever, it doesn't exist, and then there's an example of the thing. I don't have one of those, because my hypothesis here is, in the context of a live game, truly the perfect design doesn't exist. Now, what I mean by that is, designers and systems designers especially, and I'm very guilty of this, love solving problems. It's part of what probably drew us to design. I think for a long time on World of Warcraft, we tweaked our quest system or our dungeon system or our rewards with the goal and the idea that we could finally solve them. We could finally say, OK, you know what? Dungeons are perfect now. We can stop worrying about this, and we can focus our energies elsewhere and make other parts of the game better. Wouldn't that be great? Unfortunately, players are a little bit more complicated than that. A couple of examples. So in our Legion expansion, we introduced a big change to how quests work in the world. Whereas before you had to go to a town and pick something up from an NPC, in Legion we added world quests that were just on your map with tons of rewards. And some of these rewards included a new progression system called Artifact Power that gave you open-ended power progression. Players loved this. The first response we got when Legion came out was that this was like a revolutionary improvement to the gameplay loop in World of Warcraft. They wished it had been there all along, and they couldn't get enough of it. And so we looked at this and we said, awesome, we solved questing. Let's do more of this. Let's make this our new formula for what we do next. Well, then Battle for Azeroth, our next expansion, came out a couple of years later, and we were dismayed to discover that the first reaction from players when they saw it was, wait, this again? I've just spent the last 2 years doing this stuff. I was expecting something different. Another similar example, we introduced a new dungeon system that we called Mythic Plus with different modifiers and affixes to vary the experience. And initially, super well received. With not many changes other than just adding new dungeons to the pool over time, players a few years later began to tell us, we're tired of this system. It's not working for us anymore. Blizzard needs to overhaul it completely. what we see here is that novelty has inherent value. And if you're trying to come up with a single static solution to an ever-changing dynamic system that is what player psychology is, you're always going to be one step behind. WoW, for example, we went through 8 different iterations of our raid structure over the first 10 years of the game. From 40-player raids to 25, then 25 and 10, then different difficulty versions of them, then combining them, then separating them. We finally landed on 4 different versions with flexible sizes. But at the end of the day, we were changing it. Were we making it better? Like, did we land on a system, by definition, that was better than where we started because we were presumably responding to feedback and improving it? I don't think so. The system that we have today, or that we landed on after 10 years of change, actually wouldn't have worked for our players at the start of World of Warcraft. The raid scene wasn't really large or mature enough. People didn't have the need for multiple raid difficulties and multiple different sizes. We made each of those changes in response to player feedback and what we were seeing and hearing from our players as we went through this journey with them. Just because we changed from A to B doesn't mean that one is better than the other. Each was right for its time, for its place. All right, moving on. So if perfect design doesn't exist, what does that mean about balance? Well, I'm also going to say that's a challenge. Fun story from 15 years or so ago when I was a class designer working on the Death Knight class. So Death Knights have a couple of different specializations inspired by the Lich King, the iconic Warcraft character. One focuses on unholy power, another focuses on frost. And so here we see an abstraction of the player data of how much damage these two specializations were dealing in our raid content at the time. Players were very fixated on these numbers, and if you were a player of the frost specialization, you were complaining to Blizzard at the time and saying, "We are super weak. Everyone's playing Unholy. I feel dumb for playing Frost. Please fix this. Please help us." And so as a class designer, I went in, I looked at the numbers, looked at a lot of data, and came up with what seemed like the perfect solution. I'm just going to bring Frost's damage up by just the right percentage to make them right about equal to Unholy. And so we rolled out these changes. Players were very excited. And what did we see a week or two later? We saw this. Frost did indeed go up to where we hoped they would, but Unholy's performance dropped significantly. Why? Well, what happened is players at the time realized that they thought that Frost played perfectly now with the changes might be a tiny, tiny bit better than Unholy. And so the very best players, the ones who cared most about their performance, the ones who crunched the numbers and min-maxed, they switched from Unholy to Frost. That helped bring Frost up, but it also made the average performance of Unholy drop significantly. And so a few weeks passed, and after that, lo and behold, Unholy players were saying, "We need help. We're super weak. What's going on here?" Remember, we never touched them. But the lesson here is these are dynamic systems. Another great example of this from a non-World of Warcraft game, StarCraft Brood War, legendary esport. This game had its last balance patch in 1999, and then continued to be a premier esport, especially in South Korea, for decades to follow. This is data aggregated from thousands of esport-level matches from, I think, 2007 to 2011 or so. And you see the balance between the 3 major factions in a PvP head-to-head setup fluctuated massively over time, with no balance changes. There were differences in the map pools that the leagues used, but most of this represented players figuring out a new strategy, that changing the meta, then people coming up with a new strategy that in turn countered that. Anyone here who's working on or thinking about PvP balance in a modern game today, if you saw a champion in a game with a 56, 57% win rate, or one with a 43% win rate, those would be like crises that needed to be addressed immediately. And yet, this continued this way for 10 years and self-corrected. Imagine what might have been different if there were a designer actively trying to balance these numbers. Again, if you're thinking about this, from the perspective of trying to find a perfect solution, you have to understand these are dynamic systems, and that may not be possible because just by touching it, you are in fact altering the problem itself. One last piece of data here. So This is a comparison of damage done by all of our different classes in our Cataclysm raid. This is Cataclysm Classic that's on live servers right now, but it's the 2012 version of our game balance and game data exactly recreated. This is the modern raid in the 11.1 patch in War Within, the Undermine raid. So that was then, this is now. That was then, this is now. Clearly, we have gotten better at balance over the last 12 years. These bars are much closer to each other. But at the end of the day, what have we seen? Are players overall much happier about balance? Do they all praise us for having finally balanced the game so well? Turns out we hear roughly the same amount of complaints about balance. And at the end of the day, we've seen no indication that the player who is at the bottom of this list is happier that they're only 4% behind the player at the top than they were 12 years ago when they were 10 or 15% behind. Last is last. And so that brings me to the next point. When dealing with people, when dealing with players in a community, perception is what matters. I think a secret for any balance designer, in my opinion, is that in a live game, you're not actually balancing numbers. Your goal is to balance how people feel about those numbers and how people feel about their time playing the game. That can be a much more challenging task than some math. If someone feels like their class or their champion or whatever is weak, that's how they feel. And it doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong. If a systems designer were to come along and say, actually, your class is in the top third overall, is that going to make the player suddenly reevaluate their performance or their experience when they see themselves lagging behind or not being invited to groups? And in the modern era, it doesn't take a whole lot to make players feel weak or not feel great about where they stand. Right? The first thing any content creator will do whenever there's any game or a new patch or an update is make one of these wonderful tier lists. And players will instantly feel that sense of dismay when they see the thing that they prefer, F tier, D tier. And they're not going to feel good about it. So what do we do if balance is impossible? How do we drive perception? I think the biggest thing that we've settled on is rather than seeking a static answer, rather than seeking moving to an endpoint, making frequent touches. Now, whereas in the past we used to do balance patches every few months, probably every 2 weeks or so now, we release a major hotfix that tweaks a number of classes and their abilities in different contexts, with the goal being making sure that we can reassure players that if they're on the bottom right now, that's going to change pretty soon. And if they're looking at whoever's the top dog, thinking that maybe they should re-roll or change their playstyle to the flavor of the month, that, actually Blizzard's probably going to fix that soon too. I should just kind of stick with what I enjoy, and it'll be fine. Are we perfect in this? Do we always achieve our results? No. But this is what we aim to do, and this is the philosophy that guides our balance on a day-to-day basis. And really, what this is about is maintaining players' trust and confidence in the process. And that is, when you can't always be right in every situation, the most important thing. For any live game, for any ongoing game, trust is the fundamental currency of the entire ecosystem. When we ask players to spend time in our world, we're asking them to spend the most valuable thing they have, their time, with us. And I think, if you look at the discourse around whether a game is a dead game online, which is everywhere these days, I think at the root of that is players' anxiety that maybe their time is being spent in a place that in the long run will be unwise, that they're going to regret. And certainly if it feels like a development team is out of touch and isn't going to look after their interests and isn't going to respect their time, again, why would they spend their time there? And so maintaining trust through everything we do is absolutely essential. We know we're not always going to get it right. Sometimes we're missing some piece of data. Sometimes we're just going to make the wrong guess as to what players will do in response to something that we put out there. Sometimes, given the diversity of our community, it's literally impossible to please both sides. If there are two groups that want literally directly opposing things, we're going to have to disappoint one of them more often than not. But what we can do is act very quickly when we realize that we have gone astray, so that when something is off, players' reaction ideally is, hey, this isn't it, but I'm sure Blizzard will fix this, as opposed to, wow, these developers are out of touch. Do they even play their own game? And that's not to say that we can't continue to improve in this space, but that is our aim in how we communicate and how we think about the decisions we make. Transparency here can be really scary. Admitting that you were wrong, admitting that you missed something to a community when there's people looking to pick that apart is challenging. It is daunting. But in the long run, I think it's the only way to maintain trust, and you need to maintain trust for there to be a long run. Speaking of that, a lot of the way we used to think about these decisions, and a lot of the stuff that my talk that I had begun to work on 5 years ago was evaluating things, was looking at the longevity of systems and how you consider the future and how important it is to plan ahead when you're making a live service game that you expect and intend to last for years. And back then, we were looking at what seemed like some very real design problems. Here we see the original World of Warcraft talent tree from World of Warcraft Classic. You got 51 talent points to spend as you level to 60. Pretty simple, pretty iconic. But that basic premise of getting 1 point per level meant that with each new expansion, when the level cap went up to 70, you got 10 new points. There had to be 10 points to spend things on. When the cap went up to 80, you got 10 more points. And so a few years later, our trees looked like this. And this was just 2 expansions in. And we were beginning to plan expansion 3, expansion 4, and realizing like, whoa, what do we like? At some point, the UI here is a mess. This is so complex for players. It's a nightmare to balance. This is unsustainable. We need to change the system. And so we did. One of the things we did moving into our Mists of Pandaria expansion was to look at our big talent tree and say, you know what, actually, probably like 50 of the points people are spending here, they're just copying some build online anyway. Everyone gets these points. Let's just give them to you baseline so that you don't have to make that decision. And let's simplify and streamline and focus on the interesting decisions that are being made between utility or playstyle options. And you'll have everything that you used to, but the UI is much more elegant. It's much more maintainable. And as we look ahead, we can add 1 new row every expansion as needed, and we can keep doing that for a long time. This felt like a strictly superior system viewed through that design lens. Players were getting everything they previously had, and it was going to be extensible in a way that the old system wasn't. In fact, the systems designers who built the original 2004 talent system, when they saw this, they were working on other projects at Blizzard at the time, they sent over huge praise. They're like, this is amazing. We wish we'd done this 8 years ago. Great job. And then it turned out players kind of hated it. Why? Because what we had done was optimized for the long run. But what had happened was that leveling no longer felt rewarding. It no longer felt meaningful. You leveled up, and you didn't get a talent point to spend. In some cases, you basically got nothing. Maybe you got 1 thing every 10 levels. That was not adequate. And it was a resounding point of feedback. People either said they specifically didn't like the talent system, or they just, leveling felt dull and they couldn't put their finger on why. And so what we had done was, again, optimize for something at the expense of players' experience today. And if it's not fun today, if the thing you're not making isn't fun right now, will there even be a tomorrow? And so we had to take a big step back and reconsider, how we were weighing these things and what was worth it and what wasn't. And so we redid our talent system again in 2022 for our Dragonflight expansion. We moved back to something that actually looked a lot like the original system. We had a bit more horizontal progression in it. We tried to solve some of the problems that made the original one collapse under its own weight very quickly. But we committed to once again giving players 1 point every level. And as we built this system, we looked at it and we could say, we know this can't last forever. After enough years, there will be too many points. This will once again collapse under its own weight, and we'll have to do something about it. But you know what? That's okay, because it's fun today, and it's going to be fun tomorrow. And down the line, we'll figure that out when we get there. Because the alternative, there may not even be a then. And so really, you have to carefully consider, you need to think about the future, but don't be scared of or overly intimidated by it, because players are focused on every time they're logging into your game, every time they're hearing news about it, what you're offering them now. No one's having more fun today because the design elegance is going to pay off 5 years down the line. That's not how a community ever thinks, nor will they. So sometimes you see the problems, but you go ahead anyway, because it's what the right thing for your community is. And we often joke on the team these days, sometimes we'll say, like, that's a problem for future us. Future us is going to be really smart, and they'll solve it when they get there. And honestly, to some extent, there's merit in that. As we've discussed in other contexts in this talk, things change so quickly, so chaotically over time, that if you think you know what problems you're going to be facing 2 years from now, let alone 5 years from now, you're probably kidding yourself a little bit. You're going to be facing all kinds of unexpected challenges. This one that you can see coming, that you can start planning for years ahead of time and already be thinking about, you already have a leg up with that one. So one exception to this, though. There's one area where I think it is important to really stress the future. And that is a set of decisions that I call one-way ratchets, which is like a wrench that you can only turn in one direction and it just won't go back, like this visual here. And you think about that in terms of the player psychology impacts of certain decisions. If you are increasing the reward of something significantly, if you are removing a long-standing restriction, that's not something you can experiment with lightly. Because going in one direction and then trying to reverse it is going to leave players much, much more unhappy than where you started. You can't really take things like that away or reimpose restrictions because, again, that's not how people are evaluating the relative value of their experience today. And so to be a responsible steward of this live game, you have to move very carefully and cautiously in these situations. Again, it's not to say never do them. It's not to say never remove restrictions, never be super generous with some of your offerings. But understand that there are some things that you just can't take back. So one example of something that we're applying this to right now is the rules governing playing with opposite faction players in World of Warcraft. So World of Warcraft has had Alliance and Horde as these two opposing factions since the very, very beginning. And in the beginning, they were just the enemy, period. You could never do anything with them. You could never talk to them. If you were on a PvP server, they were just kill on sight, the end. But over time, we got more and more feedback from our players that were in large online communities that had tons of real-life friends. Hey, I'm talking to these people all the time on Discord, on whatever. Why can't I just invite my friend to my raid to play with me just because they happen to pick a different faction 10 years ago? Would that really hurt anything? And looking at this, we asked ourselves, like, would it? And maybe is the answer. There's 20 years of systems and assumptions and social dynamics built upon this system. And we can't totally predict what changing it will do. And we also know this is very much a one-way ratchet. There's no world where we could tell players, OK, you can now play with all of your friends of the opposite faction, and then suddenly decide a few months later, whoops, never mind, that was a mistake, we're going to undo it. That friend you played with yesterday, they have to tell them that you can't anymore. And so what do? We move slowly and gradually in this direction. We first allowed specifically real-life friends who knew each other to play together in dungeons or raids. So if you had someone that you had an existing connection with, you could invite them to your group. That went OK. We then moved one step further and allowed those people to join cross-faction guilds. And this is continuing to this day. And players admittedly have been frustrated by how slow that pace has been. They wished we just kind of jumped to the end of the line and given them all of it right away. But I think to be responsible as stewards of the game, knowing that this was a one-way path, we had to take one step at a time. But we are continuing in the direction that our players are signaling clearly to us they want to go. And so wrapping up, meeting players where they are and serving a community, is about viewing all of these decisions through a player-first, player-focused approach. It's prioritizing player problems over design problems, doing the things that matter to them as opposed to the things that bother you, avoiding falling into adversarial design patterns with your players, staying very agile, recognizing that humans, these are chaotic systems, and you're not going to find a static, perfect solution. But as long as you're moving quickly and you're responding to what you're seeing and hearing, you're going to be closer to what is best at a given moment in time. Nurture and maintain and safeguard and do everything you can do to build trust with your community and to reciprocate it. And as you make decisions, think about the future, but make sure that what you're building is fun today and is serving your players today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for the very lovely talk. I took 2 key takeaways there from the end. Cross that bridge when you get there and introduce changes slowly. We do a little bit of time for questions. Mind the audience, please ask your questions on these topics that have been presented today, and don't ask him what's going to come in the next expansion or anything that Ian obviously cannot talk about. But please go ahead. Questions? Okay, one, we have the sir here with the burgundy hoodie. A microphone is coming to you.
Thank you. Hello. Yeah, I would like to ask a question. I'm also working on one game that's pretty old. And we in design constantly battle the marketing team. And they want to use the word relaunch whenever it's possible. Have you had problems like this? How you have been tackling them? Thanks.
I think in general, with a mature game like World of Warcraft, striking a balance between serving your existing players but keeping it approachable to new players is an essential one. Because if you're not bringing in new players or bringing back people who've been away for a long time, at some point your community will dwindle. But you can't do that at the expense of the core that has kept you where you are today. And so I think there's 2 levels to that. One is actually the design philosophy and making sure that you are trying to take the community's interests and concerns to heart. For example, when we're trying to manage complexity in our game or make sure the new player experience isn't too unapproachable, frankly, a bad way of solving that problem would be to massively slash and burn complexity in the game and say, okay, we need the game to be simpler so new players can get into it. That would probably alienate our core that have built up their characters and love what they have over the last many, many years. Instead, we focus on a new player experience that has a smoother on-ramp without coming at the expense of our core. And then we, messaging-wise, try to talk about it in those terms. We would never say, all right, we've completely reinvented World of Warcraft, but we will say, we've completely changed the new player experience, and if you thought it was too late to join, think again, because there's some amazing new stuff, and that sort of thing. So ultimately, it's all a balancing game, and it's going to be a different answer depending on the specific circumstances of your community. But if you're ever forsaking one portion of your core to try to chase another, that's probably not the right play.
Great. More questions. We'll take one more from the audience. Here in the middle, the sir with the black cap.
Awesome speech. Thank you very much. It was really enlightening.
Thank you.
I played the game many, many years ago, and I took quite a long break and came back. But I had one thought when I first started playing, which was, we're allowed to add these add-ons. You can go online and you can find something that'll change your UI. You can get your DPS meters. You can do whatever you want to customize it in a way that Blizzard didn't intend. Do you ever steal from that? Because when I started playing recently, I've noticed a lot of convergence from some of the old, even just adding things to the map that allow you to find locations. Do you see what the community's doing in the modding scene in order to influence what you're doing with a 20-year-old game?
Absolutely. I think that's been something that the World of Warcraft UI has used for inspiration and to help guide its evolution for easily a dozen years. I think by having a game that's heavily moddable, you empower your players to show you what they want. Now, sometimes the custom solutions players come up with maybe very complex and very highly customizable because a power user wants to be able to tweak every little thing, and that's not going to be the best thing for the broad audience baseline. But philosophically, if players are showing us clearly that they want certain functionality in the game, they want certain information in the game. It's not ideal for them to have to go to a third-party site and get those external tools to have it. We want to try to offer it ourselves. And so that's something we've continued to do. And I think it's a very direct way of being guided by our community and seeing what they deem to be problems and prioritizing those in our design solutions.
Perfect. There are a lot of questions in the audience. Where can they direct their questions if they want to give more questions or feedback as players? Are there any channels for this?
There are many channels. Obviously, the social media, forums, etc. I'll also probably be outside, in 10 or 15 minutes after this. So you can come find me if you have questions.
Perfect. Then let's give another big round of applause for Ian.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're going to take a little short break, but don't be long. We'll be back in about 8-10 minutes with our next speaker, who's going to tell you how you can grow your game studio despite the crisis going on. See you then.